This video is going to be focused on best practices for navigating the interview conversation. I have a couple other videos, one on best practices for approaching the conversation and preparing beforehand, and another on how to organize the information around your career history. Both of those will help you going into an interview, but this video specifically will be focused on navigating that interview conversation itself. The number one most important thing, if you take nothing else from any of the information I share, take this. It's keep it high level. Inform your interviewer that you're going to give them the 10,000 foot perspective, but that they can drill down into any specifics they'd like more information on at any point. This will allow you to keep it clear and concise and not get lost in the weeds. And it also allows the interviewer to then be able to pick the specifics that they'd like more information on. So when you are sharing specifics, it's relevant to what's important to the interviewer. So again, if you take nothing else from this video, take only that. But there are a few other things we can do as well. So the other thing that I also suggest is, this concept of seek first to understand and then second to speak your piece, right? So it's really important to read the room when we're in an interview scenario. Make sure you're paying attention to the body language of the interviewer and kind of the flow and the feel of how the conversation is starting and progressing. But in the beginning of an interview, sometimes you have the opportunity to take control of the interview, or let's say take control of the conversation. And what I mean by that is you might have the opportunity to be the one who starts or leads the conversation. If you do, you can do that by asking a few questions and essentially starting the interview by you asking a question. Now, I do suggest that, again, you read the room in this scenario. It's important that you're mindful of what's appropriate. You're not coming across too strong or coming across as being aggressive. But sometimes, the interview does get off to a slower start and you do have the opportunity to start off with a question. And if you do have the opportunity, I suggest you take it. The more information you get up front, the more information and context you'll have to use throughout the interview. So you can ask a few different questions, one being, thanks for taking the time to meet with me. I'd love to know, what about my background and experience made you want to interview me, for example. You could also say something like, thanks for taking the time. I'm super excited for this interview. I've read the job description and looked at the company website, but I'd love to know your perspective on the role and what success looks like in this role as someone who's working closely with this function. Or if it's a cross-functional interview, you could ask something like, hey, I'm super excited for this conversation. I've talked to so-and-so about this role already, but I'd love to know your perspective on what the role is and how this person can be the best partner to you and your team. Whatever it is, it's an opportunity for you to get insight into what's really important to the person that you're interviewing with, and then use that information and speak specifically to what they share as the interview progresses. And then as they're sharing that information, make sure you're being a really active listener and you're really taking in what they're sharing so that you can speak specifically to that. And as you're giving examples, you're keeping in mind what they shared and giving examples that are curated to the answers that they gave you. Now, it's not always possible to do that. And if you don't have the opportunity to do that, that's totally okay. Sometimes the interviewer comes on and just starts asking questions, and that's totally fine too. In that scenario, it's just really important to go back to the first point, which is to stay high level and make sure that you're giving them the 10,000 foot view and not getting too lost in the weeds. The other thing you can do that I also suggest is, as the interviewer is asking questions, if there's anything you're not clear on, definitely ask a clarifying question and take that opportunity. So, if they ask you something that could be answered a few different ways, take the opportunity to say, hey, I just want to clarify, are you asking this or are you asking this over here? I just want to make sure that I'm answering the question, based on what's important to you. The other suggestion I have is that when an interviewer asks you for an example, that's when you get specific. So I know I always say to stay at the 10,000 foot view, but in this case, when an interview asks you specifically, hey, what about when you've done this? Or can you give me an example of a time when you did X? it's important to give them a specific example. It's not uncommon for me to get feedback from candidates that get passed on that they had a really hard time answering a question specifically. And when an interviewer asks you for an example of X time or X skill, it's not enough to just say, oh, yeah, I've done that, or oh, yeah, I did that at that place, or yeah, I have experience with that. They're asking you that because they want an example. So I suggest introducing your framework or your approach and then giving a specific example. So you could say, I always approach this type of scenario with this type of strategy. And I did that here at this company when we were dealing with a similar challenge. This is what I implemented, and this is how it worked out, or this is what I learned from that. So you're giving a specific example of how you implemented that specific approach, answering the question specifically. Another thing I like to suggest is as you're nearing the end of an interview, say if you have about 5 to 10 minutes left, asking the question to the interviewer, what's something that you were hoping to hear from me that you haven't heard so far in this interview? And that gives you the opportunity to speak to that directly. I really hate getting the feedback that a company is passing on a candidate because they feel they don't have enough experience in something that they do actually have experience in. And sometimes the interviewer is really looking for something specific and it just doesn't really come up naturally in the conversation. So to avoid that situation, asking this question allows you to be able to address that and speak to that specific thing in the event that it hasn't come up yet. And if you don't have experience in that thing that they were hoping to hear from you, it gives you the opportunity to address it. And addressing it in person and not being afraid of that also shows that you can be resilient. It shows that you're not afraid of a challenge, and it allows you the opportunity to give them an example of a time when maybe you had to solve something that you didn't have experience in, or you had to learn something new. So it gives you the chance to explain that in person. The other thing that happens as you near the end of an interview is that you often have the chance to ask questions. And I definitely suggest you come prepared with a few questions and take the opportunity to ask questions. Now, if you haven't gotten all the information about the role itself, this is a great time to do that. But if you do have a clear vision of the role, asking strategic questions is going to show that you can think strategically and critically. You can ask something like, what's the plan for the company over the next 3 to 5 years? What does success look like for the company? What's the growth path for this role as the company grows? You can ask the person you're interviewing with why they joined, what makes them excited about the future. But definitely take the opportunity to ask them, as it definitely showcases your ability to think strategically. And then lastly, it's really important to follow up with a thank you note. And this is just another opportunity to build rapport and connection with the person that you're interviewing with. Remember that ideally this is someone that you'll be working with in the future. So, taking the opportunity to continue to build that connection is really important. And when you're sending a thank you note, it's important that you make it specific and authentic. Don't send a thank you note that just says, thanks for the call, it was great to meet you. Speak specifically to the things that you enjoyed learning about on that call. It was great learning X about this company and about this role. It was great learning more about these specific challenges that this person is going to be solving. And that also gives you the opportunity to then, clarify how your background and skill set is perfectly poised to solve those problems. So definitely take the time to write a thoughtful thank you note that speaks specifically to the things you enjoyed about the conversation and reiterates the ways in which you feel like you're a great fit.